I invite you to be going with me to the book of Proverbs, chapter 1. I think verse 7 is going to be our first scripture reference that we're going to be looking at. Before we get into the lesson, just two things that I want to take note of. The first is that we've had two baptisms this afternoon. The first one was Garrett Wharf, I guess about 12:30 this afternoon. And then Colton Oberschlake, I guess that was about 3 o'clock this afternoon. And it's just been a really good, it's been a good day. It's been a really good day. People putting their faith in Jesus Christ. I was talking to Colton about his decision to be baptized, and I asked him, I said, Colton, do you understand what this is for? And he said, yes. It's so that I can die and be born again. Oh, man, that's just fantastic. That's just fantastic. And so make sure you talk to these two guys and give them your love and your encouragement for the decision that they've made to follow Jesus Christ. I just want to tell you up front about the lesson. If you came tonight for a very emotionally driven lesson, I have no emotion. I gave it all to you this morning. This is just purely learning tonight. That's really all this is. It's just going to be really straightforward. I hope that we'll learn something new about Proverbs that you haven't noticed before. There's not a lot of sermons I could do out of Proverbs that won't be done during our fall focus this year, which will be all about proclaiming the wisdom of God from the Proverbs. So we're going to get 13 lessons on Proverbs in the fourth quarter. So there's really not many topics that I could talk about that isn't already going to be covered in the fourth quarter. But there is one that's been on my mind lately. And I started kind of researching this, a couple of months ago when I was reading through the Proverbs and happened to notice that a couple of them were repeated verbatim. And that got me kind of looking into this idea that I'm just going to entitle Repeated Proverbs. And I happened to find this book, Poetic Imaginations in Proverbs, Variant Repetitions of the Nature of Poetry. I guess the K is silent, so his name would be Nut. I don't know. Let's just call him K. Martin Hyam or something, Hyam. I didn't buy the book because it was $80. And it was 500 pages, all about why Proverbs repeat themselves. And I'm not opposed to buying a book that you're not going to use but maybe once every 10 years. $80 seemed a little steep. So I went to Google's Gemini book AI module and kind of did some research in the book through the AI model. And this is what he has to say. He says that there are a number of repeated proverbs. There are 79 proverbs that are repeated at least twice. There are 15 proverbs that are repeated at least 3 times. And there are 5 proverbs that are repeated 4 times for a total of 223 verses, or 25% of the book of Proverbs. Now, just think about that for just a moment. This month in our reading plan, reading through the Old Testament, we're going to be reading through Proverbs, and you're basically going to read it 1.25 times. Because 25% of the book just repeats itself throughout the various chapters of the book. So what I'd like for us to do is explore, I don't know what I got here, 4 reasons why Proverbs will repeat itself or Proverbs will be repeated. Then what I'd like for us to do is just run through 12 Proverbs that are repeated and just kind of look at them. Some of them we'll just skim pretty quickly. A couple of them we're actually going to be reading. You got 2 options tonight. If you're using a paper Bible, printed Bible, we're going to be flipping around. If you're using an electronic Bible, maybe on your phone or your tablet, you either just need to give up or use one of the printed Bibles that's in the pew, because we're going to be going a lot, and maybe it's just me, but I'm slow about moving through my phone and the chapters and stuff. So that's kind of the course of the lesson. And the book has some really good reviews on Amazon. So if this really piques your interest and you got $80 to spare, you can have that through Prime next day. So if you live in Spring Hill, it'd be 4 days if you live in Columbia. So you can find that off Amazon. Okay, there's at least 4 reasons why we have proverbs that are repeated. The first one is just going to be emphasis and reinforcement. I mean, a couple of these that we're going to look at, you'll be like, oh, okay. Yeah, I can see why we would want to repeat that. I mean, it's really important. That's something that we need to know. In fact, the very first one that we're going to be looking at about the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. That idea is going to be repeated strategically, and it's a way of emphasizing and reinforcing this is an important piece of understanding wisdom. The second is probably just memorization. I know some of you are or have been working on memorizing Scripture, and that's good. By and large, as a culture, we don't emphasize memorization. Even growing up, going to school in McEwen, I mean, we were forced to memorize stuff back then before we could just readily look it up. And I can still probably quote most of the Gettysburg Address and the preamble. Just because you've been forced to do it too. Okay, we got a youngin that's been forced to do that too. That's good. You're a good mama and a good homeschooler. And but as a culture, we don't emphasize memorization like culture where the written word was not readily available. And so perhaps the memorization of it would be another reason. This one is maybe one that we don't often recognize, but Proverbs is not one collection of writings. In fact, it's 4 different collections of writings. Now, we attribute Proverbs to Solomon, and of course, the majority of the Proverbs that are recorded in Solomon are his Proverbs, but not all of them. In fact, there are at least 4. So, beginning with verse 1 of chapter 1, going to chapter 22 and verse 16, those are all Proverbs of Solomon. And then beginning with chapter 25, verse 1, those are the Proverbs of Solomon that Hezekiah's men compiled. And that goes all the way through chapter 29 and verse 27. So that's one collection within Proverbs. Those are his sayings. But then there are other collections that are just called wise sayings. So beginning with chapter 22 and verse 17, going through chapter 24, verse 22, those are the 30 sayings of the wise man. In fact, I've written a devotional years ago off every one of those 30 sayings. And then we just kind of, in chapter 24, about verse 23, it just says, and this also are sayings of the wise. And so that chapter just finishes out with just a collection of wise sayings. Then there are the sayings of Agur in chapter 30, verses 1 through 33. And then there's the sayings of Lemuel. A lot of people put forward that this is just a pseudonym for Solomon. But at the very least, it's its own collection. And that's chapter 31, verses 1 through 31. I'm going to leave all that up there as I still see some of you writing. Some of you have learned the technique of just taking pictures of the screen, and that's pretty cool. I like how y'all do that. I'm just going to move to the next point, and then when I see people stop writing, I'll bring it up on the slide. But the last one is nuance and contextual application. As we're going to see, some of the proverbs that repeat themselves, it may not be the whole proverb, it may just be the first part of the line, and then the conclusion will be different, or the consequence will be different. Or maybe the antecedent, the first part of the proverb is different, but the consequence is the same. Or maybe it's repeated verbatim in different places, but it has a broader application and context because there are some proverbs around it that gives it a different meaning depending on where it shows up in the book. And so kind of nuance or contextual applications kind of give us a reason for why Proverbs will be repeated in different places. So what I'd like for us to do, and we're just going to finish it out this way. I've got 12 examples. We're just going to move through these. And a couple of them, we're actually going to ask the question, why on earth is that repeated multiple times? But I kind of hope, what I hope you'll be able to say at the end of this is like, that was so interesting. I've never noticed that before. So this week, when I'm reading Proverbs, I'm going to take note of how many times I read the same proverb over and over and over again. And I think it's just a really neat way of observing how wisdom literature works. So the first one is, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, or it's the beginning of wisdom. So in Proverbs 1:7, this is the prologue to the first section of Solomon's writings. That chapters 1 through 9 is really more wisdom poetry than the Proverbs like we think of proper. You know, just wise saying after wise saying after wise saying, that doesn't start till chapter 10, verse 1. Chapters 1 through 9, it's kind of wisdom poetry. It's telling parables, it's telling stories, it's giving warnings through kind of this poetic structure. And the prologue begins with chapter 1, verse 7, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. But the epilogue to this section, which is in chapter 9, also repeats this same idea, though slightly different. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is insight. And so at least the antecedent, that opening line of the proverb, it's repeating itself, though it's ever so slightly different. But by repeating it at the beginning and at the end of this section, what are we learning? The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge and of wisdom. This book will do you no good if you do not fear the Lord. So we kind of see how that's working like that right at the very beginning. And then these are all in order by the first scripture reference. So that's the order that I got them in. The next one is chapter 6, verses 10 and 11. A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and poverty will come upon you like a robber, and won't like an armed man. And this particular section starts back up with verse 6, where there is a command to go to the ant, O sluggard, consider her ways and be wise. And so this is a section about not being a sluggard, and the example is to go to the ant. The ant will teach you how to be a diligent worker. And the conclusion then is a little sleep, a little slumber. Now we can go over to chapter 24. Now here in chapter 24, this is a different collection of sayings. These are not necessarily, let me just double check my notes here. Yeah, these are not the sayings of Solomon per se. This is just a collection of wise sayings. And so the compiler of Proverbs is telling us, these aren't Solomon's, they're common, I really like them, I think you should know them. And again, we have the same thing, except instead of the ant being the example, the sluggard becomes the example. Look at verse 30. I passed by the field of a sluggard, by the vineyard of a man lacking sense. And behold, it was overgrown with thorns, and the ground was covered with nettles. And he goes on to say, I saw it, and I considered it. And here's what I learned, verse 33. A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest. Poverty will come upon you like a robber, and won't like an armed man. So we have the exact same proverb in two different collections, but it's the same answer. Don't be lackadaisical. Watch the ant and how diligent the ant is. Look at the sluggard and see how slothful they are, and take note of the consequence. And so we have Proverbs repeated like that. We also have Proverbs where the first line is what's repeated, or the antecedent, but the consequence is different. So chapter 10, verse 1 says, a wise son makes a glad father, but a foolish son is a sorrow to his mother. And so we have that first line is going to be the same, a son to the father. The second line will be different. This case, a foolish son is a sorrow to his mother. And then in chapter 15, it's the same collection, but the consequence is different. Look at verse 20. a wise son makes a glad father, but a foolish man despises his mother. So in the first case, the foolish son just brings all kinds of sorrow to his mother. In the second case, the foolish son thinks nothing of what he does to his mother. His mother means nothing to him. And so while we have the same antecedent, we have a different consequence. And we also have Proverbs where there's a different beginning, but the same end. Just go back with me to chapter 6. Let's look this time at verse 6. Chapter 10. This time let's look at verse 6. Blessings are on the head of the righteous, but the mouth of the wicked conceals violence. And then in the same context, you just look down at verse 11. The mouth of the righteous is a fountain of life, but the mouth of the wicked conceals violence. And so this one's kind of unique. I didn't find a whole lot of examples of this, but I'll be honest, even as I was writing about this and kind of looking things up about a month or so ago, I found a whole lot more of them this week. I thought I had it actually narrowed down until I found that guy's book. And I'm like, oh, there's no way I can do this whole topic. And but this was kind of one of the only ones I found that was this close in proximity. But the mouth of the wicked conceals violence, but blessing is on the head of the righteous. The mouth of the righteous is a fountain of life. This is the section where a lot of Proverbs become these singular statements, or they form couplets with the verses before or after them. Another example, just staying in chapter 10, is found in verse 15, the first part of verse 1. A rich man's wealth is his strong city. The poverty of the poor is their ruin. And then we can also find the same similar statement in chapter 18, verse 11. A rich man's wealth is his strong city, and like a high wall in his imagination. And so in the first telling in chapter 10, verse 15, it's just making a statement. A rich person can find security in their wealth. What makes the life of a poor person so hard? It's their lack of wealth. But in chapter 18, it has a totally different meaning. A rich man's wealth is his strong city, and like a high wall is his imagination. He believes nothing will ever hurt me because I'm rich. And you can just easily pull in Luke chapter 18, the parable of the rich man and Lazarus here. And so sometimes we get the same words, but they're going to be different meanings and application depending on where they're at. Another case is chapter 13 and the latter part of verse 14, where the consequence is going to be repeated, but the first line will be different. The teaching of the wise, verse 14, is a fountain of life, that one may turn away from the snares of death. You don't really have to go very far to find it again. You'll find it in chapter 14 and verse 27. The fear of the Lord is a fountain of life, that one may turn away from the snares of death. And so kind of what did we say at the beginning? That first repeated proverb is establishing for us that if we want to be wise, it's not about just following all the advice of this book. It's really about fearing the Lord. And when we fear the Lord, it is a fountain of life. The teachings of the wise is the fear of the Lord. It's a fountain of life. It's so that one may turn away from the snares of death. Perhaps one that we know quite often, chapter 4 and verse 12, there is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. In fact, it's going to be repeated again in chapter 16 and verse 25, and it's going to be repeated verbatim. But it has a different context and a little bit different application. So go with me to chapter 14. I want you to look, because verse 12 and 11 form a couplet. In fact, they're even, perhaps even form a chiastic formation built around the word right. The house of the wicked will be destroyed, but the tent of the upright will flourish. There is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. And so you kind of see a coupling there. The first part of chapter 11 is about being the first part of verse 11 is about being destroyed. The last part of verse 12 is about death. And then we have the upright and the seems right there in the middle. You can go over to chapter 16 and the verse 25. And again, we have it listed over here. There is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. But the verses before and the verses after really don't have much of anything to do with the verse itself. Verse 24 is about gracious words are like a honeycomb. Verse 26 is a worker's appetite works for him. His mouth urges him on. And so if I was working with one of the interns about kind of formulating supporting passages for their script, for their sermons, I would tell them here, look, go to chapter 16, verse 25, if you're wanting just to quote this as kind of a singular point, because it's actually used there as a singular point, where in its first usage, it's a coupling, and it may not say what you're wanting to say, how you're wanting to use it. We also learn about a whisper, chapter 18 and verse 8, chapter 26, verse 22. Again, the words here are verbatim. The words of a whisper are like a delicious morsel. They go down into the inner part of the body. In chapter 18 and verse 8, there's actually a triplet. Verses 6, 7, and 8 are all about how we use our words and how we can be ensnared with our mouth. In chapter 22, or chapter 26, verse 22, it's actually a long section. It's verses 20 through 26 are all about how to use our mouth and the words and how we can get entrapped with them. Again, verbatim, but a slightly different application in each one because of its surrounding context. Chapter 19, verses 5 and verses 9, a false witness will not go unpunished. He breathes out lies. He will not escape. And then in verse 9, we get it repeated again, that instead this time he will perish. And again, just looking over here, this is going to kind of form kind of a longer section. And so when you see a repeated Proverbs, look for what's in the middle if they're really close, because it may be, like we saw in chapter 1, 7 and 9, 16, it may be kind of forming a couplet there. A quarrelsome wife is like a constant dripping. Okay, this one actually gets repeated 5 times. Don't laugh. I'm just going to move on. I'm just curious, like, why does this one get repeated the most? It's in different sections. It's in different collections. I'm not trying to make a joke, even though you're all laughing. I mean, really, I'm like, why this one? But it is this one. In this particular setup, a quarrelsome wife is like a constant dripping. The first part of the proverb is the same. It's in chapter 19, verse 13. A foolish son is a ruin to his father. A wife's quarreling is a continual dripping of rain. And then in chapter 27, verse 15, a continual dripping on a rainy day and a quarrelsome wife are alike. Then it goes on to actually expound upon it even further into verse 16. So we get that. That's 2 examples. But then we get this. It's better to live in a corner of a housetop than on a house shared with a quarrelsome wife. It's repeated nearly verbatim in chapter 21 and verse 9, and chapters 25 and 24, and then 21:19 is just ever so slightly different, and yet the idea is still there. It's better to live in a desert land than with a quarrelsome or a fretful woman. So at least 5 times we kind of get this structure that's dealing with the quarrelsome wife. And again, I just wonder, how many other Proverbs are going in that? And I really struggled to find more examples that were really dealing with that number of repetitions, or at least engaging in that idea. The prudent sees danger and hides himself, but the simple go on and they suffer for it. Again, 22:3 and 27:12, repeated verbatim. This is within two collections. The first one is the collection of Proverbs by Solomon. The second collection will be Proverbs that were arranged by the men of Hezekiah. But again, they're both Proverbs of Solomon. Do not move the ancient landmark. And I think this was the one that actually got me to looking at repeated Proverbs, because this saying is in the 30 sayings of the wise man in two different sections. It's chapter 22, verse 28. I'd like for us to look at both, because the first line kind of properly is called, I guess, the antecedent, but the first line sets up the consequence that is the second line. Do not move the ancient landmarks. Why? Well, your fathers have set them. So do not move the ancient landmarks that your fathers have set. And so I know this kind of gets used in sermons to say, don't mess with scriptural tradition. Really what it meant was, the ancient boundaries have been set when Joshua and all of them took the land of Canaan. Don't mess with them. They're instituted by God. I mean, it literally means don't move the land boundaries and the land markers. Occasionally when I get kind of some writer's block, or I just need to get out of the desk and go outside or something, I like to walk the perimeter of the parking lot and maybe walk down here into the subdivision. But have you ever noticed there's an ancient landmark boundary over by the mailbox? I just wonder, how long has that thing been there? But it's been there a long time. And I think about this verse every time I walk past it and see it. Don't move the ancient landmarks or the property boundaries, because they were set up by our fathers. Now, you go over to chapter 23 and look at how it's used in verse 10. Do not move an ancient landmark or enter the fields of the fatherless. It will go on to explain, for their Redeemer is strong, and he will plead their cause against you. And so here, it's not just a don't move them because they've been established. It's don't move them to take advantage of the fatherless, of the orphan, or we could also probably add here, the widow. Even though they are powerless, God will seek retribution against you if you've moved your land markers to add to your land by taking away from theirs. And so the first line is used the same, but the second line is different. That was all 12 of them for tonight. If you want to buy the book, you can read all about 223 verses and how many of them repeat. I really love the book of Proverbs. It really is one of my favorite books. I have sometimes when I just want to read something, I like to take it down and just kind of skim through it. I'll admit my favorite passages start with chapter 10 and kind of reading the individual Proverbs and just kind of learning from them. And so this week, as you're going through Proverbs, look for those repeated ones and the repetition that's used, and kind of just take note of them. Like, maybe I need to really commit that one to memory. Maybe I really need to learn that one, because the Spirit decided that would need to be repeated more than once. And as we're reading through them, remember this: the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. It is the beginning of wisdom. Fools despise that kind of knowledge. But those who love the Lord, they soak it up and they make it their own. It's the guiding principle of their life. Dave's got a song of encouragement for us. I have decided to follow Jesus. We've had 2 people today already make that good confession that they're going to follow Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior. to die to Him and to be born again. We'd love for you to add your name to those two already, to submit your life to Him. Whatever your spiritual need is, won't you come?